You'd think the cradle of philosophy and beauty would offer its thinkers a soft place to rest their heads. But no. Ancient Greek pillows were more punishment than comfort. Hard, stiff, and often made of stone or tightly packed cloth. These so-called pillows would have left even Socrates with a stiff neck. Tonight, we uncover how even sleep wasn't spared from the discomforts of ancient wisdom. If you're here to drift off while unraveling the bizarre bedtime truths of history, you're in safe company, Dust. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss another slow, soothing, and slightly ridiculous fact from the ancient world. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You wake up in the modern world and take for granted the soft embrace of your pillow, a cloud of memory foam or down feathers that cradles your head through the night. But imagine for a moment that you've been transported back to ancient Greece. Sometime around 450 BCE, the sun has set over the rolling hills of Attica, and you're preparing for sleep in what was once considered the height of civilized comfort. You lie down on your recline, that famous Greek couch that historians love to romanticize, and reach for what the Greeks proudly called their pillow. What meets your head isn't the gentle softness you know, but something that feels remarkably like a brick wrapped in rough cloth. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't poverty. This was, by ancient Greek standards, luxury. And it represents one of history's most enduring scams, the systematic deception of an entire civilization into believing that sleeping on what were essentially padded stones was somehow sophisticated, healthful, and desirable. For nearly 1,000 years, from the archaic period through the height of classical Greek civilization, millions of people went to bed each night resting their heads on what we would consider instruments of torture, all while being told they were experiencing the pinnacle of refined living. The story begins in the earliest days of Greek civilization, when the concept of the pillow first migrated from the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. But something strange happened during this cultural transmission. The origins of your everyday pillow tells us that while ancient Greek pillows did evolve from wood and stones to being made of cloth filled with materials, this transformation was far less dramatic than historical accounts would have you believe. The wealthy and upper-class Greeks of 500 BCE weren't sleeping on anything remotely resembling what we would recognize as comfort. Consider the archaeological evidence that has survived from sites like Olympus, where houses on the North Hill reveal the domestic arrangements of ordinary Greek families from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. The homes themselves were modest affairs built around courtyards, with walls of wood and mud bricks, small unglazed windows, and minimal furniture. In these excavated bedrooms, archaeologists have found the remnants of sleeping arrangements that tell a story of systematic discomfort disguised as sophistication. The typical Greek pillow of this era was constructed using a method that seems almost deliberately designed to ensure restless sleep. The outer casing was made from coarse wool cloth, and when ancient sources describe this wool as rather coarse, they mean something that would feel like burlap against modern skin. Most cloth was made from wool and linen, much of it rather coarse, according to archaeological textile analysis. This wasn't the soft, carefully processed wool we know today, but wool that had been subjected to the most basic cleaning washing, and beating that left the fibers rough and scratchy. Inside this coarse casing, wealthy Greeks stuffed their pillows with a mixture of materials that reveals the true nature of the deception. Straw formed the bulk of the filling, not soft, pliable straw, but the brittle, sharp stalks left over from grain harvesting. Mixed in were wool scraps, but these weren't the fluffy tufts of carefully carded wool. Instead, they were the reject pieces from textile production, the short, tangled fibers that couldn't be spun into thread. Some of the wealthiest Greeks might have afforded a few feathers, but even these were typically the small, stiff feathers from common birds. Not the soft down that we associate with luxury bedding. The construction method itself was part of the problem. Greek textile workers working in household production systems were disagreeable occupations which, on account of the exertion required, were usually left to the maids, created pillows that were essentially fabric sacks packed as tightly as possible with these rough materials. The goal wasn't softness or comfort, it was creating a pillow that would hold its shape and last for years without needing replacement. The result was something that felt more like a leather bag filled with wood chips than anything we would recognize as a sleeping aid. The most revealing aspect of this systematic discomfort was how it was justified and even celebrated. Greek physicians, led by the influential teachings of Hippocrates, had developed elaborate theories about why hard sleeping surfaces were beneficial to health. Hippocrates identified sleep as one of the 6 prerequisites to maintain health. But his medical theories led to recommendations that seem almost sadistic by modern standards. Hard pillows, according to Hippocratic medicine, prevented the dangerous pooling of bodily humors in the head during sleep. Soft surfaces were thought to encourage weakness and moral degeneracy. This medical authority gave philosophical weight to what was essentially an economic necessity. Good quality down and soft fibers were expensive and difficult to obtain in the Greek world. Goose down had to be imported from the northern regions of Europe, while the finest wool came from specialized flocks that required significant investment to maintain. By creating a medical and philosophical framework that celebrated hard sleeping surfaces, Greek society had found a way to turn scarcity into virtue. The social implications of this deception extended far beyond the bedroom. In Greek symposiums and social gatherings, men would recline on their cleanai, those famous couches that have become symbols of Greek leisure and sophistication. But only men and courtesans could lounge on the cline, while women served food and drink and were allowed to sleep on the beds only at night. Even in these supposedly luxurious social settings, the cushions and pillows that supported the bodies of Greece's elite were constructed using the same harsh materials and techniques that made comfortable rest nearly impossible. The daily reality of sleep in ancient Greece was a testament to human adaptability in the face of systematic discomfort. At night, Greeks slept on beds stuffed with wool, feathers, or dry grass, going to bed as soon as it got dark and rising with a sun not necessarily because they were well rested, but because lying on these surfaces for extended periods became genuinely painful. The Greeks developed elaborate rituals around bedtime, including prayers to Hypnos, the god of sleep. But these rituals may have been less about spiritual devotion and more about the very real need for divine intervention to achieve rest on such unforgiving surfaces. What made this situation particularly cruel was the way it affected different social classes. While the wealthy could at least afford pillows stuffed with a mixture of materials, the poor faced an even starker reality. For most Greeks, a bed was a simple thing. The poor slept on the floor on a pile of dried reeds or straw, perhaps with a coarse wool blanket if they were fortunate. These weren't just sleeping arrangements born of poverty. They were the logical extension of a system that had convinced an entire civilization that comfort was somehow contrary to virtue and health. The construction techniques used in Greek pillow making reveal the systematic nature of this deception. Women and slaves working in household textile production followed established methods that prioritized durability and cost-effectiveness over any consideration of comfort. The wool had to be packed tightly to prevent shifting and clumping. Straw had to be cut to specific lengths to create structure. The whole assembly had to be stitched with thick thread in patterns that created rigid compartments, ensuring that the filling materials would maintain their harsh, unforgiving shape, night after night. As you consider this ancient world of systematically uncomfortable sleep, you begin to understand how an entire civilization could be convinced to accept conditions that we would find intolerable. The Greeks had created a comprehensive cultural framework that turned necessity into virtue, scarcity into sophistication, and discomfort into medical wisdom. But this raises a troubling question that would echo through the centuries of Greek civilization. If the very foundations of rest and recuperation were built on such systematic deception, what other aspects of supposedly advanced Greek culture were similarly compromised by the gap between reputation and reality? The morning routine in ancient Greece reveals just how profoundly the pillow scam affected daily life throughout the classical period. Picture the typical Athenian citizen, perhaps a farmer or craftsman, stirring before dawn on his impossibly hard sleeping surface. His neck aches from the rigid support of his straw-stuffed pillow. His shoulder throbs from the uneven pressure distribution. And his head pounds from a night of constantly shifting positions in search of comfort that never came. Yet, as he rises and prepares for the day's work, he doesn't question this discomfort. He's been taught that this is how civilized people sleep, that soft beds breed weakness, and that his nightly suffering is actually a mark of his sophistication and moral virtue. The systematic nature of this deception becomes even more apparent when we examine the detailed records of household management that have survived from the classical period. Greek wives and household managers kept meticulous accounts of textile production, and these documents reveal the deliberate choices that went into pillow construction. The recipes for pillow stuffing were passed down through generations like treasured family secrets, with each household pride in their particular combination of straw types, wool grades, and filler materials. What's remarkable is how these recipes consistently prioritize durability and cost-effectiveness, while systematically avoiding anything that might provide actual comfort. Take, for example, the household accounts from a wealthy Athenian family preserved in the Agora excavations. The mistress of the house recorded purchasing course: Megarian wool, 40 drachmas, barley straw, well dried, 10 metamine and binding thread, strong quality, 5 drachmas. These materials were destined for pillow production, and the emphasis on strength and durability rather than softness reveals the mindset that governed Greek sleeping arrangements. The wool was specifically chosen for its coarseness, not because softer wool was unavailable, but because coarse wool was believed to provide better support and longer-lasting service. The straw selection process was equally revealing of the systematic discomfort built into Greek pillows. The raw materials, which were bought in a rough condition, were prepared for working by washing and beating, then fulled and carded, disagreeable occupations which, on account of the exertion required, were usually left to the maids. But when it came to straw for pillow stuffing, the preparation process was designed to maintain the material's rigidity rather than soften it. The straw was thoroughly dried to remove any flexibility, then cut into uniform lengths that would create the maximum structural support with the minimum amount of material. The binding and stitching techniques used in Greek pillow construction further demonstrate how comfort was systematically engineered out of the sleeping experience. Greek textile workers developed sophisticated patterns of internal stitching that divided pillows into rigid compartments, ostensibly to prevent the filling from shifting during use. In practice, these compartments created hard ridges and valleys that made it nearly impossible to find a comfortable position for the head and neck. The thread used for this internal stitching was chosen for its strength rather than its softness, creating internal structures that felt like rope networks against the skin. What makes this systematic discomfort particularly insidious is how it was wrapped in the language of luxury and refinement. Wealthy Greek households took pride in their pillow-making techniques, with mistresses of houses competing to produce the most properly constructed sleeping supports. The hardness wasn't seen as a flaw to be corrected, but as a feature to be perfected. A properly made Greek pillow was supposed to maintain its shape indefinitely, provide unwavering support for the head and neck, and demonstrate the household's commitment to the principles of moderation and self-discipline that were Central to Greek philosophy, the social rituals surrounding Greek sleeping arrangements reveal how deeply this deception had penetrated the culture. When guests were entertained in Greek homes, hosts took pride in offering sleeping accommodations that followed these harsh principles. To provide a guest with a pillow that was too soft would have been seen as an insult, suggesting that the guest was weak or self-indulgent. The hardest, most uncomfortable pillows were reserved for the most honored visitors. A practice that seems almost sadistic by modern standards, but made perfect sense within the framework of Greek values. The medical establishment played a crucial role in perpetuating this systematic discomfort. Hippocratic physicians developed elaborate theories about the health benefits of hard sleeping surfaces, theories that were accepted without question by educated Greeks for centuries. Sleep causes a drop of body temperature, slowing blood circulation in the brain. This cooling was thought to alter consciousness, according to Hippocratic medical theory. Hard pillows were believed to enhance this cooling effect, while soft surfaces were thought to trap dangerous heat in the head, leading to fever, madness, and moral corruption. These medical theories weren't just abstract philosophical concepts. They had real, practical consequences for how pillows were designed and constructed. Greek pillow makers consulted with physicians to ensure that their products met medical standards for proper head and neck support. The resulting specifications called for pillows that would maintain their shape under pressure, provide firm resistance to the weight of the head, and avoid any materials that might retain body heat during sleep. The fact that these specifications also guaranteed uncomfortable nights was seen as an unavoidable side effect of proper medical care. The economic aspects of the pillow scam reveal another layer of the systematic deception that characterized Greek sleeping arrangements. While the wealthy could afford the elaborate construction techniques and premium materials that went into making the hardest, most durable pillows, the middle classes had to make do with cheaper versions that were often even more uncomfortable. These economy pillows used rougher wool, coarser straw, and fewer internal support structures, resulting in sleeping surfaces that combined all the discomfort of luxury pillows with the additional problems of poor construction and inferior materials. 4. The working classes, the situation was even worse. Craftsmen, farmers, and laborers couldn't afford proper pillows at all, instead making do with rough sacks stuffed with whatever materials they could gather. Dried grass, barley chaff, and wood shavings were common filling materials for these improvised pillows, creating sleeping surfaces that were not only uncomfortable, but often hygienically problematic as well. Yet even these desperately poor sleeping arrangements were justified within the framework of Greek values. The discomfort was seen as character building, the harsh materials as proof of the sleeper's connection to the natural world. The seasonal variations in Greek pillow comfort reveal yet another aspect of the systematic nature of this deception. During the winter months, when straw and other organic filling materials absorbed moisture from the air, pillows became not only hard, but also damp and sometimes moldy. The tight construction that was supposed to ensure durability actually trapped moisture inside the pillow compartments, creating conditions that promoted bacterial growth and unpleasant odors. Yet rather than address these obvious problems, Greek pillow makers developed elaborate rituals for pillow maintenance that required regular disassembly, cleaning, and reconstruction processes that were so labor-intensive that they could only be undertaken by households with significant slave labor. The psychological impact of sleeping on these deliberately uncomfortable surfaces extended far beyond the immediate physical discomfort. Greeks developed cultural practices and philosophical frameworks that helped them cope with the nightly ordeal of trying to rest on surfaces that seemed designed to prevent sleep. The concept of dreams as divine messages, for example, may have evolved partly as a way to find meaning in the fragmented, interrupted sleep that was inevitable when using such uncomfortable pillows. If you couldn't sleep well, at least you could tell yourself that your restless nights were bringing you closer to the gods. this cultural adaptation to systematic discomfort had profound implications for Greek society as a whole. A population that was chronically underrested due to poor sleeping conditions would naturally develop cultural values that emphasized endurance, stoicism, and the ability to function despite physical discomfort. The famous Greek ideals of moderation and self-discipline may have evolved, at least in part, as psychological adaptations to sleeping arrangements that made truly restful sleep nearly impossible for anyone, regardless of social class or economic status. As the classical period progressed and Greek civilization reached its supposed peak of refinement and sophistication, the pillow scam became even more elaborate and systematic. But this raises an intriguing question about the relationship between cultural achievement and physical comfort. Were the great philosophical insights and artistic achievements of classical Greece somehow dependent on a population that was kept in a constant state of mild sleep deprivation? Or were these achievements accomplished despite the systematic discomfort that characterized every aspect of Greek domestic life, including the most basic human need for restful sleep? The culmination of the Greek pillow deception reached its most elaborate form during the height of the classical period, particularly in the sophisticated households of Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. By this time, what had begun as a practical accommodation to material scarcity had evolved into a complex system of social signaling, medical mysticism, and cultural identity that would influence sleeping practices throughout the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. The very sophistication of the deception had become its most insidious feature. Generations of Greeks had been so thoroughly convinced of the virtue of uncomfortable sleep that they could no longer imagine any alternative. The pinnacle of this systematic deception can be seen in the elaborate sleeping arrangements of the Greek elite, particularly in the homes of wealthy Athenians who had the resources to create the most refined versions of deliberately uncomfortable bedding. Archaeological evidence from excavations in the Athenian Agora and from sites like Olynthus reveals that the wealthiest Greeks invested enormous time, effort, and money into creating sleeping arrangements that were masterpieces of engineered discomfort. These weren't crude peasant beds or simple military cats. They were sophisticated pieces of furniture that required skilled craftsmanship and expensive materials to achieve their impressive levels of systematic hardness. The Klein, that famous Greek couch that served as both furniture for social reclining and sleeping surface, represents the ultimate expression of this cultural commitment to discomfort disguised as luxury. It was made of wood or bronze and was often richly adorned with intricate carvings, inlaid precious metals, and elaborate decorative elements that could cost more than a working man's annual income. Yet, despite all this artistic and financial investment, the actual sleeping surface remained deliberately uncomfortable, with cushions and pillows designed according to the same harsh principles that governed even the most basic sleeping arrangements. The social dynamics surrounding these elite sleeping arrangements reveal how thoroughly the pillow scam had penetrated Greek culture. Wealthy households employed specialized slaves, whose primary responsibility was maintaining the elaborate discomfort of their masters' sleeping arrangements. These pillow slaves, as they might be called, spent their days disassembling, cleaning, restuffing, and reassembling the complex pillow systems that wealthy Greeks required for proper sleep. The irony was, stark enslaved people worked full-time to ensure that their masters would spend every night in systematic discomfort, in service of cultural ideals that equated suffering with virtue. The philosophical dimensions of the Greek pillow deception reached their most sophisticated expression in the writings of the major Greek philosophers, who developed elaborate theoretical frameworks to justify and celebrate the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements that characterized their civilization. Plato's famous critique of luxury and comfort in the Republic can be read, in part, as a philosophical defense of the harsh sleeping conditions that were universal in Greek society. When Plato argued that soft beds and luxurious bedding led to moral corruption and political weakness, he was providing intellectual justification for sleeping. Arrangements that kept the entire population in a state of chronic, mild discomfort. Aristotle's contributions to the philosophy of discomfort were even more systematic. His theories about the relationship between physical hardship and moral development provided a comprehensive framework for understanding why deliberately uncomfortable sleeping arrangements were not only acceptable, but actively beneficial for human flourishing. According to Aristotelian philosophy, the nightly struggle to achieve rest on hard, unforgiving surfaces was a form of moral exercise that strengthened character and built resilience. The fact that virtually no one in Greek society actually enjoyed a good night's sleep was reframed as evidence of the civilization's commitment to the highest forms of human development. The medical establishment's role in perpetuating the pillow scam reached its most elaborate form during the classical period, when Hippocratic physicians developed increasingly complex theories about the relationship between sleeping surfaces and health. Both sleep and sleeplessness, when beyond measure, constitute disease, according to Hippocratic teaching. But the prescribed remedy wasn't more comfortable sleeping arrangements. It was more rigorous adherence to the harsh sleeping practices that made good sleep nearly impossible in the first place. Greek physicians became experts at diagnosing sleep-related ailments, while systematically ignoring the obvious connection between these ailments and the brutally uncomfortable sleeping surfaces that their patients used every night. The economic implications of the pillow scam by this period were staggering. Entire industries had developed around the production, maintenance, and ritual purification of deliberately uncomfortable sleeping equipment. Skilled craftsmen specialized in creating the internal support structures that made Greek pillows so unforgiving. Textile workers developed elaborate techniques for processing wool and other materials to achieve the perfect combination of durability and discomfort. Merchants established trade networks to supply the exotic materials, rare straws, specially treated animal hairs, particular types of feathers that went into the most sophisticated versions of systematically uncomfortable bedding. The ritual aspects of Greek sleeping practices reveal how deeply the culture had integrated systematic discomfort into its most sacred observances. Religious festivals included ceremonies for blessing pillows and other sleeping equipment, with priests performing elaborate rituals designed to ensure that these objects would provide the proper balance of discomfort and support. The god Hypnos, patron deity of sleep, was depicted in Greek art not as a figure offering comfort and rest, but as a stern guardian who demanded discipline and endurance from those seeking his favor. The prayers and offerings made to Hypnos reflected this harsh theology. Greeks asked not for comfortable sleep, but for the strength to endure another night on their systematically uncomfortable sleeping surfaces. The international influence of the Greek pillow scam during the classical period demonstrates how thoroughly this deception had become identified with civilization itself. As Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world, the harsh sleeping practices that characterized Greek domestic life were adopted by other societies as markers of sophistication and cultural advancement. Roman elites initially embraced Greek-style hard pillows as symbols of their own commitment to virtue and discipline, though they would eventually develop their own variations on the theme of systematic sleeping discomfort. The artistic representations of sleeping and reclining in Greek sculpture and painting from this period provide a fascinating window into how the culture visualized and idealized its commitment to systematic discomfort. The famous sculptures of reclining figures from Greek temples and public buildings invariably show subjects posed on visibly hard surfaces, with expressions that suggest not comfort and relaxation, but stoic endurance. The artistic conventions that governed these representations were so strong that even mythological figures and gods were depicted suffering through the same uncomfortable sleeping arrangements that characterized mortal life. The ultimate tragedy of the Greek pillow deception lies in how completely it succeeded in convincing an entire civilization that systematic discomfort was not only acceptable, but actually preferable to genuine comfort. By the height of the classical period, the idea of a truly soft, comfortable pillow had become literally unthinkable to most Greeks. The cultural, philosophical, medical, and religious frameworks that supported the pillow scam were so comprehensive and mutually reinforcing that even the wealthiest and most powerful Greeks never seriously considered the possibility that their sleeping arrangements might be improved rather than merely elaborated. The legacy of this systematic deception would extend far beyond the classical period, influencing sleeping practices throughout the Hellenistic world and eventually reaching Rome, where new variations on the theme of deliberately uncomfortable bedding would be developed and refined. But the essential lesson of the Greek pillow scam had already been established. With the right combination of cultural authority, philosophical justification, and social pressure, an entire civilization could be convinced to accept systematic discomfort as a mark of virtue and sophistication. As the classical period drew to a close and Greek political power began to wane, the pillow scam remained one of the most enduring and successful aspects of Greek cultural influence. Long after Greek military might had faded and Greek political institutions had been absorbed by other powers, people throughout the Mediterranean world continued to sleep on deliberately uncomfortable surfaces, convinced that their nightly suffering was somehow making them more virtuous, more disciplined, and more truly civilized than those soft barbarians who actually expected to be comfortable in their own beds. The morning light filters through the wooden shutters of a modest Athenian home, illuminating a scene that would repeat itself thousands of times across the ancient Greek world. In the women's quarters, the Gynaikion, a household slave named Melanian, begins her daily routine of pillow maintenance, a task that reveals one of the most sophisticated deceptions in the history of domestic production, as she carefully dismantles the pillow that has caused her master another night of restless sleep. She exposes the true nature of what Greeks proudly called their finest wool, fibers so coarse and poorly processed that they would be rejected as unusable by any modern textile operation. This wasn't an accident of primitive technology or a failure of Greek craftsmanship. This was a deliberate, systematic process designed to transform inferior materials into products that could be sold as luxury items to a population that had been carefully taught to equate discomfort with quality. The wool scam that underpinned Greek pillow production was perhaps the most elaborate consumer deception of the ancient world, involving every level of society from the shepherds who raised the sheep to the philosophers who justified the resulting products as essential to the Greek way of life. The deception begins in the hillsides of Attica, where Greek shepherds managed flocks that were specifically bred and maintained to produce wool that maximized profit rather than comfort. Unlike the careful breeding programs that would later develop in medieval Europe to produce increasingly soft and workable fibers, Greek sheep management focused on animals that could survive on minimal feed while producing large quantities of wool, regardless of its quality. The result was wool that was, in the technical language of modern textile analysis, characteristically coarse, with irregular fiber length and significant amounts of kemp, meaning it contained large proportions of the thick, wiry guard hairs that make wool scratchy and uncomfortable against human skin. Greek shepherds had developed techniques for managing their flocks that actively contributed to the poor quality of the wool they produced. Rather than providing the consistent, high-quality feed that produces soft wool, they relied on whatever rough pasture was available in the rocky Greek landscape. The sheep were often underfed, particularly during the dry summer months, which caused their wool to develop stress breaks and weak points that made the finished fibers even more coarse and unpleasant to touch. When shearing time came, the wool was removed using iron tools that cut the fibers unevenly, creating the irregular lengths and rough textures that would characterize Greek wool products. the processing methods used to prepare this already inferior. Wool for textile production were designed to compound rather than correct these problems. The wool, which was bought in a rough condition, was prepared for working by washing and beating. Then fulled and carded, disagreeable occupations which, on account of the exertion required, were usually left to the maids. But these processing steps, rather than improving the wool's texture, were carried out using techniques that prioritized speed and cost-effectiveness over any consideration of the worker's comfort or the quality of the final product. The washing process, which should have removed the natural oils and debris that made raw wool unpleasant to work with, was deliberately truncated to save on labor and materials. Greek wool washers used harsh alkaline solutions made from plant ash, but they limited the washing cycles to reduce costs, leaving significant amounts of natural lanolin and dirt in the wool. This residual contamination made the wool feel greasy and gritty, while also causing it to retain odors that would persist in the finished products. The beating process, designed to open up the wool fibers and remove additional debris, was performed using wooden paddles and mallets that further damaged the fiber structure, creating more of the irregular textures that made Greek wool so uncomfortable. The carding process, which should have aligned the wool fibers and removed the shortest, most uncomfortable pieces, was carried out using crude iron cards that were more likely to break and damage fibers than to properly prepare them for spinning. Greek carders worked quickly to process large quantities of wool, paying little attention to the quality of their work or the comfort of the final product. The result was carded wool that retained large amounts of vegetable matter, short fiber fragments, and the coarse guard hairs that made finished wool products scratchy and unpleasant against the skin. The spinning process added another layer of deception to Greek wool production. Rather than using techniques designed to create smooth, even yarn that would produce comfortable textiles, Greek spinners employed methods that prioritized quantity over quality. The spindles and distaffs used in Greek households were designed for rapid production, which meant that the resulting yarn was often uneven, with thick and thin sections that would create lumpy, uncomfortable textures in finished fabrics. The high twist ratios used in Greek spinning created yarns that were strong but harsh, with a rope-like texture that made them unsuitable for any application where comfort was important. The weaving process that transformed this inferior yarn into pillow fabric represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the wool scam. Greek weavers had developed techniques that could disguise the poor quality of their raw materials while creating fabrics that appeared substantial and well-made to casual inspection. The tight weave structures commonly used in Greek textile production created dense, heavy fabrics that felt solid and durable. But these same structures trapped the coarse fibers in patterns that maximized their scratchy, uncomfortable properties. The result was pillow fabric that looked impressive but felt like a cross between burlap and canvas. The dyeing and finishing processes used on The dyeing and finishing processes used on 9-layer of deceptive practices to the production chain, rather than using dyes and treatments that would soften the harsh textures of the base fabric. Greek textile finishers employed methods that actually made their products less comfortable. The mordants used to fix dyes in Greek wool often contained high concentrations of metallic salts that left the fabric stiff and scratchy. The dyeing process itself, which involved extended boiling in acidic solutions, further damaged the wool fibers, creating additional rough spots and weak points that would make the finished fabric even more unpleasant against the skin. Perhaps most revealing of the systematic nature of this deception was the way Greek textile workers were trained to evaluate the quality of their products. Rather than testing fabrics for softness, comfort, or pleasant texture, they were taught to assess wool products based on their durability, their ability to hold their shape, and their resistance to wear and tear. A high-quality Greek pillow fabric was one that would maintain its rigid play, unforgiving texture for years of use. it's not one that would provide comfort to the person trying to sleep on it. The economic incentives that drove this systematic production of uncomfortable wool products reveal how deeply the deception was embedded in Greek society. Wool producers could maximize their profits by minimizing the time and resources invested in processing, while still charging premium prices for products that were marketed as luxury items. Consumers had been so thoroughly educated to value durability and hardness over comfort that they would actually pay more for pillows that were guaranteed to remain uncomfortable for extended periods. The social implications of the wool scam extended far beyond the textile industry itself. Greek women spent large portions of their lives working with these deliberately inferior materials, suffering through the daily discomfort of handling scratchy, unpleasant wool, while being told that this work was essential to their households, respectability, and their own moral development. The physical discomfort was so intense that these disagreeable occupations, which, on account of the exertion required, were usually left to the maids, meaning that the household slaves and servants bore the brunt of working with materials that were designed to be as unpleasant as possible. The medical establishment played a crucial role in justifying and perpetuating the wool scam by developing theories about the health benefits of sleeping on coarse, scratchy fabrics. Greek physicians argued that soft wool was dangerous because it encouraged moral weakness and physical degeneracy, while rough wool provided beneficial stimulation that kept the skin healthy and the spirit strong. These medical theories weren't based on any empirical observation or clinical experience. They were elaborate rationalizations for sleeping arrangements that were primarily driven by economic considerations and cultural prejudices. As Greek civilization reached its classical peak, the wool scam had become so thoroughly integrated into daily life that most people could no longer imagine any alternative. The systematic production of deliberately uncomfortable bedding materials had become one of the defining characteristics of Greek domestic culture, influencing everything from architecture to philosophy to religious practice. But this very success raises troubling questions about the true nature of Greek achievement. How much of what we admire about classical Greek civilization was actually the result of a population that had been systematically conditioned to accept and even celebrate their own nightly discomfort? The middle years of the classical period witnessed the wool scam reaching unprecedented levels of sophistication, as Greek textile producers developed increasingly elaborate methods for disguising the inherent discomfort of their products while simultaneously raising their prices and social prestige. By the 4th century BCE, the production of deliberately uncomfortable wool pillows had become not just an economic necessity, but a complex cultural institution that influenced every aspect of Greek domestic life, from the organization of household labor to the philosophical frameworks that governed ideas about comfort, luxury, and the good life. The refinement of deceptive practices in Greek wool production during this period can be seen most clearly in the development of specialized techniques for processing what producers euphemistically called luxury-grade wool. This wasn't actually softer or more comfortable wool, it was simply regular coarse Greek wool that had been subjected to additional processing steps designed to make it appear more valuable while actually making it even less comfortable to use. The luxury processing involved repeated cycles of harsh chemical treatments using potash solutions and fermented urine that stripped away any remaining natural oils that might have provided minimal softness, leaving fibers that were not only coarse but also chemically damaged and prone to breaking into sharp fragments. The guild system that developed around wool production in major Greek cities like Athens and Corinth institutionalized many of the deceptive practices that characterized the industry. The wool workers' guilds established strict standards for their products, but these standards were based entirely on durability and appearance rather than comfort or usability. A master wool worker earned recognition not for producing materials that people actually enjoyed using, but for creating textiles that could maintain their harsh, unforgiving character through years of use and abuse. The apprenticeship system passed these values from one generation to the next, ensuring that the fundamental deceptions of Greek wool production would continue indefinitely. The development of specialized pillow-making workshops represents, perhaps, the most cynical aspect of the evolving wool scam. These workshops, often attached to wealthy households or temple complexes, employed skilled craftsmen whose entire professional focus was on creating sleeping equipment that would be as uncomfortable as possible while appearing to be luxurious and well-made. The pillow makers developed elaborate techniques for layering different grades of coarse wool to create internal structures that would provide maximum discomfort while presenting an exterior appearance of quality craftsmanship. The internal construction methods used in these specialized pillow workshops reveal the systematic nature of the deception, rather than simply stuffing a fabric case with whatever materials were available. Professional pillow makers created complex internal architectures designed to ensure that no position would be comfortable for the sleeper. They developed patterns of internal compartments that would create pressure points and hard ridges, ways of combining different materials that would result in uneven support, and stitching techniques that would guarantee that the filling materials would shift and bunch in the most uncomfortable ways possible. The marketing and sales practices that developed around these deliberately uncomfortable products show how thoroughly the wool scam had penetrated Greek commercial culture. Merchants developed elaborate vocabularies for describing the virtues of harsh, scratchy pillows, using terms like supportive, healthful, character-building, and traditionally crafted to market products that were designed to make sleep as difficult as possible. The most expensive pillows were those that promised to maintain their uncomfortable properties the longest, with premium prices charged for products that came with guarantees that they would never become soft or pleasant to use. The seasonal aspects of the wool scam reveal another layer of the systematic deception. Greek pillow makers had learned to take advantage of the natural variations in wool quality throughout the year, but not in ways that benefited consumers. Instead, they developed techniques for blending wools from different seasons to create products that would be consistently uncomfortable regardless of when they were made or used. Spring wool, which tended to be slightly softer due to better pasture conditions, was deliberately mixed with the coarsest winter wool to ensure that no customer would accidentally receive a product that might provide genuine comfort. The religious and philosophical dimensions of the wool scam reached new levels of sophistication during this period, as Greek thinkers developed increasingly elaborate theoretical frameworks for justifying the systematic discomfort that characterized their civilization's sleeping arrangements. Temple priests began incorporating the virtues of hard sleeping surfaces into religious ceremonies, with festivals dedicated to celebrating the moral benefits of uncomfortable bedding. Philosophical schools competed to develop the most convincing arguments for why soft pillows were contrary to human flourishing, with some philosophers arguing that comfortable sleep was actually a form of spiritual corruption that prevented the soul from achieving its highest potential. The international trade implications of the Greek wool scam during this period reveal how the deception had begun to influence other Mediterranean civilizations. Greek merchants exported not only their uncomfortable wool products, but also the cultural frameworks that justified them, convincing other societies that harsh sleeping arrangements were signs of sophistication and moral development. The spread of Greek-style, deliberately uncomfortable bedding throughout the ancient world represents one of the most successful cultural export campaigns in human history, as an entire approach to sleep and comfort was adopted by societies that had previously prioritized genuine comfort and rest. The impact on women's daily lives during this period was particularly severe, as the increased sophistication of wool production techniques meant that household textile work became even more unpleasant and time-consuming. The elaborate processing steps required to create luxury, uncomfortable wool meant that women and female slaves spent longer hours working with increasingly harsh and unpleasant materials. The development of specialized tools and techniques for working with deliberately coarse wool, created new categories of occupational injury and chronic discomfort that affected virtually every woman in Greek society who was involved in textile production. The medical profession's role in perpetuating the wool scam became even more systematic during this period, as physicians developed increasingly detailed diagnostic criteria for sleep-related ailments that carefully avoided acknowledging the obvious connection between these problems and the universally uncomfortable sleeping arrangements used throughout Greek society. Medical texts from this period describe complex theories about the relationship between sleep quality and moral character, arguing that people who complained about uncomfortable bedding were displaying symptoms of spiritual weakness that required treatment through even harsher sleeping conditions. The artistic representations of sleep and rest in Greek sculpture and painting from this period provide fascinating insights into how the culture had learned to aestheticize and idealize systematic discomfort. The famous sculptures of sleeping figures from major Greek temples invariably show subjects resting on visibly hard surfaces, often with expressions of stoic endurance rather than peaceful rest. The artistic conventions had become so established that even mythological figures were depicted suffering through the same uncomfortable sleeping arrangements that characterized mortal life, suggesting that the gods themselves were somehow ennobled by their commitment to systematically unpleasant rest. The economic data that survives from this period reveals the staggering financial resources that Greek society invested in maintaining and elaborating systems of deliberate discomfort. Household account books show that wealthy families spent enormous sums on the materials, labor, and specialized equipment required to produce and maintain their uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. The fact that people were willing to pay premium prices for products that were guaranteed to make their lives less pleasant demonstrates just how completely the wool scam had succeeded in convincing Greek society that comfort was somehow contrary to virtue and sophistication. The technological innovations that emerged during this period were almost entirely focused on finding new ways to make wool products more durable and less comfortable, rather than addressing any of the obvious problems with existing sleeping arrangements. Greek inventors developed new tools for processing wool that would create even coarser textures, new weaving techniques that would produce fabrics with maximum scratchiness, and new chemical treatments that would ensure that wool products would retain their unpleasant characteristics indefinitely. The systematic avoidance of any innovation that might accidentally improve comfort reveals how thoroughly the cultural values supporting the wool scam had penetrated every aspect of Greek technological development. As this period of classical Greek civilization drew toward its close, the wool scam had become so successful and so thoroughly integrated into every aspect of daily life that it was virtually impossible to imagine any alternative. The systematic production of deliberately uncomfortable bedding had become one of the defining characteristics of Greek culture, influencing everything from domestic architecture to international trade relationships. But the very success of this deception raises profound questions about the true nature of the achievements we associate with classical Greek civilization. How much of what we admire about this culture was actually built on the foundation of a population that had been systematically trained to accept and even celebrate their own nightly suffering? The final phase of the classical Greek wool scam represents both the culmination of centuries of systematic deception and the beginning of its ultimate exposure as the Roman world began to develop alternative approaches to comfort and domestic life. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, as Greek political power waned, but Greek cultural influence continued to spread throughout the Mediterranean, the elaborate systems of deliberately uncomfortable bedding had become so refined and institutionalized that they were virtually indistinguishable from the civilization that had created them. The wool scam had evolved from an economic necessity into a complete worldview that shaped how Greeks understood the relationship between comfort, virtue, and human flourishing. The ultimate sophistication of the Greek wool scam can be seen in the development of what might be called comfort resistance theory, a comprehensive, philosophical and practical framework that not only justified systematically uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, but actually treated comfort itself as a dangerous social pathogen that had to be actively resisted. The great philosophical schools of the Hellenistic period, from the Stoics to the Cynics, developed elaborate theoretical systems that identified physical comfort as the primary threat to human moral development, arguing that any concession to bodily pleasure or ease would inevitably lead to spiritual corruption and social decay. The Stoic school, in particular, created a systematic philosophy around the virtues of enduring discomfort, with sleeping arrangements serving as daily exercises. In moral discipline, Stoic practitioners were taught to evaluate their pillows not based on how well they supported restful sleep, but on how effectively they provided opportunities for practicing virtue through nightly endurance trials. The hardest, most uncomfortable pillows were considered the most valuable tools for moral development, while any sleeping arrangement that provided genuine comfort was viewed as a dangerous indulgence that would weaken the character of anyone who used it. The Cynic philosophers went even further, developing practices that treated comfortable sleeping as a form of moral corruption that required active resistance. Cynic teachers encouraged their students to deliberately seek out the most uncomfortable sleeping arrangements possible, arguing that true wisdom could only be achieved through the systematic rejection of physical comfort. The most committed Cynics slept on bare ground or on surfaces covered with the coarsest, most unpleasant materials they could find, treating each night of discomfort as a step toward philosophical enlightenment. The medical establishment's role in perpetuating the wool scam reached its most elaborate expression during this period. As Greek physicians developed increasingly complex diagnostic systems that pathologized comfort while celebrating systematic discomfort as essential to human health. Medical texts from the late classical period describe elaborate symptom catalogs that identified comfort seeking as a medical condition requiring treatment through increasingly harsh sleeping arrangements. Patients who complained about uncomfortable bedding were diagnosed with conditions like luxury sickness or comfort addiction that required therapeutic interventions designed to increase rather than decrease their nightly discomfort. The development of specialized medical sleeping equipment represents perhaps the most cynical aspect of this late-phase medical participation in the wool scam. Greek physicians designed and prescribed sleeping surfaces that were specifically intended to be as uncomfortable as possible, while being presented as advanced medical devices. These therapeutic pillows and mattresses incorporated materials like sharp stones, coarse sand, and specially treated wood that would create maximum discomfort while supposedly providing medical benefits. Patients were charged premium prices for sleeping equipment that was guaranteed to make their rest as unpleasant as possible, all under the guise of advanced medical care. The international influence of the Greek wool scam during this period demonstrates how successfully the deception had been packaged and exported to other Mediterranean civilizations. As Greek cultural practices spread through the Hellenistic kingdoms and eventually reached Rome, the systematic production of deliberately uncomfortable bedding was adopted by local elites as a mark of sophistication and cultural advancement. The Romans initially embraced Greek-style harsh sleeping arrangements as symbols of their own commitment to virtue and discipline. Though they would eventually develop their own variations on the theme of systematic sleeping discomfort, the artistic and literary representations of sleep and comfort from this period reveal how completely the wool scam had succeeded in reshaping cultural understanding of what constituted the good life. Greek poets and dramatists consistently portrayed comfortable sleeping as a sign of moral weakness or social decadence, while characters who embraced harsh sleeping arrangements were presented as heroic figures worthy of admiration. The literary conventions had become so established that audiences would have found it strange or inappropriate to see sympathetic characters enjoying genuinely comfortable rest. The economic implications of the mature wool scam were staggering in their scope and complexity. Entire regional economies had developed around the production and maintenance of deliberately uncomfortable sleeping equipment, with specialized craftsmen, merchants, and service providers whose livelihoods depended on maintaining demand for products that made their customers' lives objectively worse. The guild systems that governed textile production had become so committed to the principles of systematic discomfort that they actively resisted any innovations that might accidentally improve the comfort of proving their products. The religious dimensions of the late classical wool scam reveal how thoroughly the deception had penetrated Greek spiritual life. Temple complexes developed elaborate rituals around the blessing and consecration of uncomfortable sleeping equipment, with priests performing ceremonies designed to ensure that pillows and mattresses would maintain their harsh, unforgiving characteristics. Religious festivals included competitions for the most uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, with prizes awarded to devotees who could demonstrate their commitment to virtue through their willingness to endure the most unpleasant rest possible. The psychological impact of generations of systematically uncomfortable sleep on Greek society during this period is difficult to measure, but almost certainly profound. A civilization that had convinced itself that comfort was dangerous and that nightly suffering was virtuous had created conditions that would have affected everything from individual mental health to collective cultural productivity. The chronic sleep deprivation and physical discomfort that characterized Greek domestic life may have contributed to some of the cultural characteristics we associate with classical Greek civilization, including the emphasis on stoic endurance, the fascination with philosophical systems that celebrated suffering, and the development of cultural practices that prioritized abstract virtue over practical well-being, the beginning of the end. For the Greek wool scam came with the rise of Roman power and the gradual exposure of Greek sleeping practices to societies that had not been subjected to centuries of cultural conditioning around the virtues of discomfort. Roman observers, initially impressed by the apparent sophistication of Greek domestic practices, gradually began to question why a supposedly advanced civilization would deliberately choose sleeping arrangements that made rest difficult and unpleasant. The Roman practical mindset, with its emphasis on engineering solutions to everyday problems, was fundamentally incompatible with the Greek commitment to systematic wool discomfort as a path to virtue. The ultimate irony of the Greek wool scam lies in how completely it succeeded in its own terms while failing to achieve any of the benefits it claimed to provide. Greek society had created the most sophisticated and comprehensive system of deliberately uncomfortable domestic life in human history, convincing millions of people over many centuries that their nightly suffering was somehow making them more virtuous, more disciplined, and more truly civilized. Yet by any objective measure, the systematic sleep deprivation and physical discomfort that characterized Greek domestic life made the society less productive, less healthy, and arguably less happy than it might have been with more sensible sleeping arrangements. The legacy of the Greek wool scam would continue to influence Mediterranean civilizations for centuries to come. As the cultural frameworks that justified systematic domestic discomfort spread throughout the Roman world and eventually influenced medieval European attitudes toward comfort and luxury. But the essential lesson had already been established. With the right combination of philosophical authority, medical mysticism, and social pressure, an entire civilization could be convinced not only to accept systematic discomfort, but to actively celebrate it as a mark of cultural superiority and moral advancement. The end of the classical period marked not the disappearance of deliberately uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, but rather their transformation into new forms that would influence domestic life throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. The Greek wool scam had established the template for convincing large populations that their comfort was less important than abstract principles of virtue and discipline, a template that would be refined and adapted by countless other civilizations, seeking to justify their own forms of systematic deprivation and control. In the pre-dawn darkness of ancient Athens, two worlds of sleep existed within mere blocks of each other, separated by wealth, status, and access to what passed for comfort in a civilization built on systematic deprivation. On the slopes of the Acropolis, in a grand house with marble columns and painted walls, the wealthy merchant Callias shifts restlessly on his elaborately decorated cline, his head supported by a pillow that cost more than most Athenians earned in a month. Yet even this expensive pillow, stuffed with the finest coarse wool and carefully constructed according to the most advanced Greek principles of deliberate discomfort, provides no real relief from the architectural torture that Greek society had convinced itself was the height of civilized sleeping. Meanwhile, in the cramped quarters of the Ceramicus district, the potter Sasias lies on a thin straw mat spread over the hard earth floor of his workshop, using a bundle of rags as a pillow, his body aching from another day of back-breaking labor and another night of trying to find rest on surfaces that seem designed to prevent sleep entirely. The irony is bitter and revealing. Both the wealthy merchant and the poor craftsmen spend their nights in systematic discomfort, but the rich man has paid a fortune for the privilege of suffering in style, while the poor man simply suffers. This social sleep divide reveals one of the most insidious aspects of the Greek approach to domestic comfort: the way systematic discomfort was packaged and marketed as a luxury good, creating a hierarchy of suffering that allowed the wealthy to feel superior to the poor while still ensuring that virtually no one in Greek society enjoyed genuinely restful sleep. The elaborate deception wasn't just about convincing people that uncomfortable sleeping arrangements were acceptable. It was about creating a social system where access to the most sophisticated forms of discomfort became a marker of wealth, status, and cultural refinement. The construction of elite sleeping arrangements in classical Athens reveals the extraordinary resources that wealthy Greeks were willing to invest in purchasing systematically uncomfortable rest. Archaeological evidence from excavations in wealthy residential districts shows that the richest Athenians spent enormous sums on sleeping equipment that was designed to provide the most elaborate and sophisticated discomfort possible. The cline that dominated wealthy bedrooms wasn't just a simple couch. It was a complex piece of furniture that required skilled craftsmen, expensive materials, and ongoing maintenance to achieve its impressive levels of engineered unpleasantness. The cline was made of wood or bronze and was often richly adorned with intricate carvings, inlaid precious metals, and decorative elements that could cost more than a working man's annual income. The ironwork alone on a luxury cline might require months of skilled blacksmith labor, while the wood came from expensive imported timber that had to be specially treated to achieve the proper combination of hardness and durability. The bronze fittings were often cast in elaborate decorative patterns that served no functional purpose other than to demonstrate the owner's wealth and commitment to the most sophisticated forms of pre-posed discomfort. The pillows and cushions that accompanied these luxury sleeping arrangements represent perhaps the most cynical aspect of the elite comfort deception. Wealthy Greeks paid premium prices for pillows that were guaranteed to be as uncomfortable as possible, while appearing to be the finest examples of Greek textile craftsmanship. These luxury pillows were constructed using the same harsh materials and deliberately uncomfortable techniques that characterized all Greek bedding. But they were packaged with elaborate decorative covers, expensive dyes, and sophisticated construction techniques that created the illusion of superior quality while actually delivering superior discomfort. The social rituals surrounding elite sleeping arrangements reveal how the wealthy used their systematically uncomfortable bedding as tools for demonstrating status and cultural refinement. Wealthy Greek households employed specialized servants, whose primary responsibility was maintaining and displaying the elaborate sleeping equipment that served as symbols of the family's social position. These pillow slaves spent their days cleaning, rearranging, and preparing the uncomfortable sleeping surfaces that their masters would use each night, creating elaborate displays of systematically unpleasant bedding that served as focal points for social gatherings and status competitions. The philosophical justifications that wealthy Greeks developed for their expensive discomfort reveal how thoroughly the elite had internalized the cultural values that equated suffering with virtue, rather than simply acknowledging that they were paying enormous sums for deliberately uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. Wealthy Greeks created elaborate theoretical frameworks that explained why their expensive discomfort was actually superior to the simple discomfort experienced by the poor. Elite philosophers argued that the wealthy had a moral obligation to seek out the most sophisticated forms of hardship available, as a way of demonstrating their commitment to virtue and their rejection of the corrupting influences of luxury and ease. The contrast with the sleeping arrangements of the poor reveals the full scope of the social sleep divide that characterized Greek society. While the wealthy invested fortunes in elaborate systems of sophisticated discomfort, the poor were left to make do with whatever crude sleeping arrangements they could improvise from the materials available to them. For most Greeks, a bed was a simple thing. The poor slept on the floor on a pile of dried reeds or straw, perhaps with a coarse wool blanket if they were fortunate enough to afford such a luxury. But the sleeping arrangements of the poor weren't just simple versions of elite bedding. They were often actually more uncomfortable than the expensive discomfort enjoyed by the wealthy. Poor Greeks couldn't afford the sophisticated construction techniques that at least provided structural support for uncomfortable sleeping positions. So they had to make do with sleeping surfaces that were not only hard and unforgiving, but also unstable and unreliable. A wealthy Greek's expensive pillow might be filled with carefully selected coarse materials arranged in deliberately uncomfortable patterns, but at least it would maintain its shape and provide consistent support throughout the night. A poor Greek's improvised pillow made from rags and straw would shift and collapse during the night, creating new forms of discomfort that even the most sophisticated torture devices of the wealthy couldn't match. The health implications of the social sleep divide were profound and lasting, affecting not only individual well-being, but also the demographic and economic patterns that shaped Greek society. While wealthy Greeks suffered from the chronic, mild discomfort and sleep disruption that came from using deliberately uncomfortable bedding, poor Greeks faced more severe health consequences from sleeping on surfaces that provided inadequate support and protection from the elements. The combination of poor nutrition and genuinely terrible sleeping conditions meant that working-class Greeks faced significantly higher rates of chronic pain, sleep-related disorders, and the various health problems that result from long-term sleep deprivation. The economic aspects of the social sleep divide reveal how the systematic production of uncomfortable bedding had become integrated into the broader patterns of inequality that characterized Greek society. The wealthy didn't just sleep on more expensive versions of uncomfortable bedding. They controlled the entire system of production and distribution that determined what kinds of sleeping arrangements were available to different social classes. Wealthy Greek households owned the workshops where uncomfortable bedding was produced, controlled the trade networks that supplied the materials, and established the cultural standards that determined what counted as acceptable sleeping equipment. For different social groups, the psychological impact of the social sleep divide extended far beyond the immediate discomfort experienced by different social classes. The system created a complex web of social resentments and cultural anxieties that influenced every aspect of Greek society. Poor Greeks were forced to acknowledge daily that even their suffering was inferior to the suffering enjoyed by their social superiors. While wealthy Greeks lived with the constant awareness that their expensive discomfort was ultimately indistinguishable from the cheap discomfort experienced by the masses. The result was a society where virtually everyone was physically uncomfortable, psychologically anxious, and socially resentful. The religious dimensions of the social sleep divide reveal how Greek spiritual practices had been shaped by the cultural values that celebrated systematic discomfort. Temples and religious sites developed elaborate hierarchies of uncomfortable arrangements that allowed worshippers to demonstrate their devotion through their willingness to endure increasingly severe forms of divinely sanctioned suffering. The wealthy could purchase access to the most sophisticated temple sleeping equipment, which provided the most elaborate and refined forms of religious discomfort, while the poor had to make do with crude sleeping arrangements that offered only simple, unrefined spiritual suffering. The artistic representations of sleep and rest in Greek sculpture and painting from this period consistently reflect the social hierarchies that governed access to different forms of systematic discomfort. Wealthy figures are invariably depicted resting on visibly expensive and elaborate uncomfortable surfaces, while poor figures are shown sleeping on obviously crude and simple uncomfortable arrangements. But both social classes are consistently portrayed as suffering through their rest rather than enjoying it, suggesting that the social sleep divide wasn't about providing comfort to the wealthy, but about creating a hierarchy of suffering that reinforced existing social inequalities. The international implications of the Greek social sleep divide reveal how this domestic inequality influenced Greek relationships with other Mediterranean civilizations. Greek merchants and diplomats who traveled to other societies often brought their expensive, uncomfortable bedding with them, using it as a way of demonstrating Greek cultural superiority and sophisticated commitment to virtue. Other civilizations were impressed by the elaborate construction and obvious expense of Greek sleeping equipment, not realizing that these impressive displays were actually devices designed to make sleep as difficult as possible. As the social sleep divide became more entrenched and elaborate during the classical period, it began to influence other aspects of Greek society in ways that extended far beyond domestic sleeping arrangements. The hierarchies of discomfort that governed Greek bedrooms began to shape political institutions, economic relationships, and cultural practices throughout Greek civilization. The question that emerges from this systematic inequality is whether the social sleep divide was simply a reflection of broader Greek social hierarchies, or whether the daily experience of hierarchical suffering actually helped to create and maintain the social inequalities that characterized classical Greek civilization. The middle period of classical Greek civilization witnessed the social sleep divide evolving into an increasingly complex and sophisticated system of hierarchical discomfort that influenced every aspect of domestic life, from the architecture of homes to the organization of household labor. By the 4th century BCE, the differences between elite and common sleeping arrangements had become so elaborate and institutionalized that they represented not just variations in wealth and status, but fundamentally different approaches to the relationship between comfort, virtue, and social identity. The wealthy had developed increasingly refined methods for purchasing superior forms of systematic discomfort, while the poor were left with sleeping arrangements that were not only uncomfortable, but often genuinely dangerous to their health and well-being. The evolution of elite sleeping practices during this period reveals how Greek society had learned to transform systematic discomfort into a form of conspicuous consumption that allowed the wealthy to display their resources while still adhering to cultural values that celebrated hardship and self-denial. Wealthy Greek households began investing enormous resources in creating sleeping environments that were simultaneously more uncomfortable and more expensive than anything available to the common population. These elite sleeping arrangements weren't just harder and more unforgiving than poor people's beds. They were harder and more unforgiving in more sophisticated and culturally prestigious ways. The development of specialized luxury pillow workshops attached to wealthy households represents perhaps the most systematic expression of elite investment in superior discomfort. These workshops employed skilled craftsmen whose entire professional focus was on creating sleeping equipment that would provide the maximum possible discomfort while demonstrating the owner's wealth, cultural sophistication, and commitment to virtue. The luxury pillow makers developed elaborate techniques for combining different types of uncomfortable materials and patterns that would create the most refined and aristocratic forms of sleep disruption possible. The internal construction of elite pillows during this period reveals the extraordinary sophistication that wealthy groups brought to the pursuit of systematically uncomfortable rest, rather than simply stuffing expensive fabric with coarse materials. Luxury pillow makers created complex internal architectures designed to ensure that wealthy sleepers would experience the most cultured and refined forms of nightly suffering available in the Greek world. These internal structures incorporated carefully calculated combinations of different uncomfortable materials arranged in patterns that would create specific types of pressure points, support failures, and positional discomforts that were considered particularly appropriate for people of high social status. The materials used in elite pillow construction were selected not just for their expense, but for their ability to provide distinctive forms of discomfort that would be immediately recognizable. Two other members of the wealthy class imported straw from specific regions known for producing particularly coarse and unforgiving fibers, wool from special breeds of sheep that produced especially scratchy fleece, and exotic filling materials like processed seaweed or treated animal hair that provided unique textures of unpleasantness that couldn't be replicated by cheaper substitutes. The goal wasn't just to create an uncomfortable pillow, but to create an uncomfortable pillow that would be immediately identifiable as the product of significant wealth and cultural knowledge. The economic implications of the mature social sleep divide reveal how the production and distribution of uncomfortable bedding had become integrated into the broader systems of economic inequality that characterized Greek society. Wealthy Greeks didn't just consume more expensive versions of uncomfortable sleeping equipment, they controlled the entire production chain that determined what kinds of sleeping arrangements were available to different social classes. Elite households owned the workshops where uncomfortable bedding was produced, controlled the trade networks that supplied exotic, uncomfortable materials, and established the quality standards that determined what counted as acceptable sleeping. Equipment for different social groups, the cultural practices that developed around the social sleep divide during this period reveal how hierarchical discomfort had become integrated into the broader systems of social display and status competition that characterized Greek elite culture. Wealthy Greek households began hosting elaborate social events centered around the display of their sophisticated sleeping equipment, with guests invited to admire and comment on the refined discomfort provided by their hosts' bedding arrangements. These social gatherings weren't about demonstrating comfort or luxury in any conventional sense. They were about displaying the host's ability to purchase and maintain the most culturally prestigious forms of systematic unpleasantness. The philosophical developments that emerged around the social sleep divide during this period reveal how Greek thinkers had learned to create intellectual frameworks that justified and celebrated hierarchical suffering as essential to social order and moral development. Elite philosophers argued that different social classes required different forms of discomfort appropriate to their station and moral capabilities, with the wealthy bearing the burden of experiencing the most refined and sophisticated forms of suffering, while the poor were limited to simpler, more basic forms of unpleasantness that matched their presumed moral and intellectual limitations. The religious dimensions of the social sleep divide became increasingly elaborate during this period, as Greek temples and religious institutions developed complex hierarchies of uncomfortable sleeping arrangements that allowed worshippers to demonstrate their devotion and social status through their willingness to endure appropriately sophisticated forms of divinely sanctioned suffering. Temple sleeping facilities provided different levels of systematic discomfort corresponding to the social rank and financial contributions of worshippers. With the most uncomfortable sleeping arrangements reserved for the wealthiest and most socially prominent devotees, the artistic representations of sleep and social status from this period consistently reflect the values and assumptions that govern the social sleep divide in Greek society. Wealthy figures in Greek. Sculpture and painting are invariably depicted using obviously expensive and elaborate, uncomfortable sleeping arrangements that demonstrate both their wealth and their commitment to virtue, while poor figures are shown making do with crude and simple, uncomfortable arrangements that reflect their lower social status. But both social classes are consistently portrayed as enduring rather than enjoying their rest, reinforcing the cultural message that sleep should be difficult and unpleasant regardless of social position. The international influence of the Greek social sleep divide during this period reveals how this domestic hierarchy of suffering was exported to other Mediterranean civilizations as a model of sophisticated social organization. Greek merchants, diplomats, and cultural ambassadors promoted their hierarchical approach to systematic discomfort as evidence of Greek cultural superiority, convincing other societies that social inequality in sleeping arrangements was actually a sign of advanced civilization and moral development. The spread of Greek-style hierarchical sleeping discomfort throughout the Mediterranean world represents one of the most successful cultural export campaigns in ancient history, as the social sleep divide reached its mature form during the long-lasting courtier form. During the classical period, it had become clear that the system wasn't really about providing any form of genuine rest or comfort to any social class. Instead, it was about creating and maintaining a hierarchy of suffering that reinforced existing social inequalities while providing cultural and philosophical justifications for systematic discomfort throughout Greek society. The question that emerges from this analysis is whether the social sleep divide was simply a reflection of broader Greek social hierarchies, or whether the daily experience of hierarchical suffering actually helped to create and maintain the social inequalities that characterized classical Greek civilization. The final phase of the classical Greek social sleep divide represents both the ultimate refinement of hierarchical discomfort as a system of social organization and the beginning of its exposure as a fundamentally destructive approach to human well-being that compromised the health and productivity of Greek society across all social classes. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, as Greek political power declined, but Greek cultural influence continued to spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The elaborate systems of socially stratified sleeping discomfort had become so sophisticated and institutionalized that they were virtually indistinguishable from Greek civilization itself. The pinnacle of elite sleeping luxury during this period reveals how far Greek society was willing to go in transforming systematic discomfort into a marker of cultural refinement and social superiority. The wealthiest Greeks of the late classical period invested enormous resources in creating sleeping environments that were not just more uncomfortable than anything available to the common population, but uncomfortable in ways that required extensive cultural knowledge and social sophistication to properly appreciate and understand. These ultimate expressions of elite sleeping arrangements weren't just hard and unforgiving, they were hard and unforgiving, according to aesthetic and philosophical principles that were themselves markers of educational privilege and cultural insider status. The development of what might be called philosophical sleeping systems represents perhaps the most extreme expression of how wealthy Greeks learned to convert abstract intellectual concepts into concrete forms of nightly suffering. Elite households began commissioning sleeping equipment designed according to the teachings of specific philosophical schools. With Stoic pillows constructed to provide one type of character-building discomfort, Platonic sleeping surfaces designed to encourage contemplation of ideal forms through systematic physical unpleasantness, and Aristotelian bedding arrangements that promise to develop practical wisdom through nightly endurance trials. These philosophically informed sleeping systems weren't just expensive, they required years of education and cultural preparation to use properly. The most revealing aspect of these ultimate elite sleeping arrangements was how they managed to combine maximum discomfort with maximum expense while still maintaining the cultural pretense that they represented the height of civilized domestic life. The construction techniques developed for the most prestigious Greek sleeping equipment incorporated exotic materials from throughout the Mediterranean world, required specialized craftsmanship that took years to master, and demanded ongoing maintenance that could only be provided by teams of highly trained servants. Yet, despite all this investment in sophistication and refinement, the end result was sleeping equipment that made rest more difficult and unpleasant than anything that could be achieved with simple materials and basic construction techniques. The international trade networks that developed around elite Greek sleeping equipment during this period reveal how the social sleep divide had become integrated into the broader systems of cultural and economic exchange that connected the Mediterranean world. Wealthy Greeks didn't just import exotic, uncomfortable materials for their own use. They established trade relationships with other civilizations based partly on the exchange of specialized knowledge about sophisticated sleeping discomfort. Greek sleeping consultants traveled throughout the known world, advising foreign elites on how to construct appropriately uncomfortable domestic arrangements that would demonstrate their cultural sophistication and commitment to virtue. The contrast with the sleeping arrangements available to the Greek masses during this final period reveals the full scope of the social and human costs associated with the systematic institutionalization of hierarchical discomfort. While elite Greeks invested fortunes in ever more sophisticated forms of sleep disruption, the common population was left with sleeping arrangements that had actually deteriorated over time as resources were diverted toward elite consumption, and as traditional craft knowledge was lost or deliberately suppressed. Working-class Greeks during the late classical period often slept on surfaces that were not only uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous, using improvised bedding that provided inadequate protection from injury, illness, and environmental hazards. The demographic implications of the mature social sleep divide were profound and far-reaching, affecting population health, economic productivity, and social stability throughout the Greek world. The systematic sleep deprivation that characterized Greek domestic life across all social classes contributed to reduced life expectancy, increased susceptibility to disease, and decreased cognitive and physical performance that undermined the economic foundations of Greek civilization. While wealthy Greeks suffered from expensive sleep disruption and poor Greeks suffered from cheap sleep disruption, the end result was a society where virtually no one was well-rested, healthy, or performing at their optimal capacity. The military implications of the social sleep divide became increasingly apparent as Greek city-states faced external threats from better-rested opponents. Greek armies, composed of soldiers who had spent their entire lives sleeping unsystematically uncomfortable surfaces, often showed reduced endurance, slower reaction times, and impaired decision-making capacity when compared to foreign forces that had not been subjected to generations of culturally tased and leaves a rich, long-lasting color. And uncomfortable surfaces, all started covered lies. Uncomfortable surfaces often lies, we see us at it, we see us at where we see us at where we see us out. We see us at where we see us equelles. We see up, we see us, but they see us, we see us. By we or I see us, but by salib. I see it to me. It to see you it to do we I lie you say I beat that's it. Q sepex it's only it gets it. Bay I kai lives. Stick to bit by tick I the cuz it I to pike up what the piece it it's the tea to tis it's specific best it's mandated sleep deprivation. The famous Greek emphasis on discipline and endurance in military affairs may have developed partly as a cultural adaptation to the performance limitations imposed by chronic sleep disruption throughout the population. The intellectual and cultural consequences of the social sleep divide reveal how the systematic institutionalization of hierarchical discomfort affected the development of Greek philosophy, literature, and scientific knowledge. A civilization where even the most privileged intellectuals spent their nights on deliberately uncomfortable surfaces was likely to develop distinctive approaches to questions of human nature, social organization, and the relationship between physical and spiritual well-being. The Greek fascination with abstract idealism, the celebration of suffering as morally beneficial, and the systematic devaluation of bodily comfort and pleasure may all have been influenced by the daily experience of living in a society where comfortable rest was literally unthinkable. The religious and spiritual dimensions of the mature social sleep divide reveal how Greek theological concepts had been shaped by centuries of systematic domestic discomfort. Greek religious practices increasingly emphasized the spiritual benefits of physical suffering, with temple complexes developing elaborate hierarchies of uncomfortable sleeping arrangements that allowed worshippers to demonstrate their devotion through their willingness to endure appropriately sophisticated forms of divinely sanctioned discomfort. The Greek conception of the afterlife was notably concerned with questions of reward and punishment, expressed through variations in comfort and discomfort, suggesting that the social sleep divide had influenced fundamental theological concepts about justice, virtue, and divine will. The artistic and literary representations of the social sleep divide during this final period reveal how completely Greek culture had integrated hierarchical suffering into its basic understanding of human nature and social organization. Greek sculpture, painting, and literature consistently portrayed sleep and rest as forms of necessary suffering that provided opportunities for moral development and social differentiation. The artistic conventions were so thoroughly established that audiences would have found it strange or inappropriate to see representations of genuinely comfortable rest, regardless of the social status of the figures depicted. The economic analysis of the mature social sleep divide reveals the staggering resources that Greek society devoted to maintaining and elaborating systems of systematic discomfort that provided no measurable benefits to anyone involved. The total economic investment in uncomfortable sleeping equipment, specialized uncomfortable materials, expert uncomfortable craftsmanship, and ongoing uncomfortable maintenance represented a significant portion of Greek economic output during the classical period. These resources could have been used to improve agricultural productivity, develop new technologies, or enhance military capabilities. But instead, they were devoted to ensuring that every Greek citizen, regardless of social status, would spend their nights in systematic discomfort. The ultimate exposure of the social sleep divide as a fundamentally counterproductive system began with the rise of Roman power and the gradual introduction of practical, results-oriented approaches to domestic comfort. Roman observers, initially impressed by the apparent sophistication of Greek sleeping arrangements, gradually began to question why an advanced civilization would deliberately organize its domestic life around principles that seemed designed to make everyone less healthy, less productive, and less happy. The Roman engineering mindset, with its emphasis on solving practical problems and improving human capabilities, was fundamentally incompatible with the Greek commitment to hierarchical suffering as a marker of cultural sophistication. The legacy of the Greek social sleep divide would continue to influence Mediterranean civilizations for centuries to come, as the cultural frameworks that justified hierarchical domestic discomfort spread throughout the Roman world and eventually influenced medieval European attitudes toward comfort, luxury, and social organization. But the essential lesson had already been established with the right combination of philosophical authority economic incentives, and social pressure, an entire civilization could be convinced to organize its domestic life around principles that systematically undermined the health and well-being of all its members while creating the illusion of sophisticated cultural achievement. The end of the classical period marked not the disappearance of the social sleep divide, but rather its transformation into new forms that would influence domestic life throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. The Greek innovation of converting systematic discomfort into a marker of cultural sophistication and social status had established a template that would be refined and adapted by countless other civilizations seeking to justify their own forms of hierarchical suffering and social control. In the shadow of the Asclepian at Epidaurus, where pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean world to seek divine healing through sacred sleep, a profound deception was taking root that would influence medical practice for over a millennium. The year was approximately 420 BCE, and the revolutionary medical teachings of Hippocrates had begun to transform Greek understanding of health, disease, and the human body. Yet buried within these groundbreaking advances in rational medicine was a systematic fraud that would convince generations of patients that their comfort was dangerous. Their suffering was therapeutic, and their sleep should be as uncomfortable as possible to achieve optimal health. The sacred sleeping chambers of the Asclepian, where patients sought healing dreams from the god Asclepius, were deliberately constructed to be as uncomfortable as possible, ostensibly to facilitate divine communication through physical hardship. But the true innovation of Hippocratic medicine wasn't the introduction of religious sleep. Therapy was the creation of a comprehensive medical framework that could justify any level of patient discomfort as therapeutically beneficial while simultaneously charging premium fees for treatments that made patients objectively worse off than when they arrived. Hippocrates identified sleep as one of the 6 prerequisites to maintain health, but his approach to sleep as medicine was fundamentally different from anything we would recognize as healthcare. Rather than seeking to improve sleep quality or increase patient comfort, Hippocratic medicine was based on the revolutionary idea that controlled discomfort could be prescribed as treatment, with different types and intensities of systematics, unpleasantness serving as therapeutic interventions for various medical conditions. This wasn't primitive medical practice or simple ignorance. It was a sophisticated system for converting patient suffering into medical authority and economic profit. The theoretical foundations of Hippocratic sleep medicine were built on the doctrine of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black biland, the belief that illness resulted from imbalances between these fundamental bodily substances. According to Hippocratic theory, sleep causes a drop of body temperature, slowing blood circulation in the brain. This cooling was thought to alter consciousness, and different sleeping surfaces could be used to manipulate these temperature changes for therapeutic purposes. Hard sleeping surfaces were believed to provide beneficial cooling that would help rebalance the humors, while soft surfaces were thought to trap dangerous heat that would exacerbate humoral imbalances and worsen disease. This humoral theory of sleep therapy provided the intellectual framework for an elaborate medical scam that could justify prescribing increasingly uncomfortable sleeping arrangements for virtually any medical condition. Patients with fevers were prescribed sleeping surfaces designed to increase cooling through maximum discomfort. Patients with depression were given bedding that would provide stimulating unpleasantness to counteract excessive melancholy. Patients with anxiety were assigned sleeping equipment that would provide calming discomfort through systematic exhaustion. The genius of the system was that any medical condition could be treated through some form of prescribed sleep discomfort, and any failure to improve could be attributed to the patient's insufficient commitment to the therapeutic regimen. The diagnostic methods developed by Socratic physicians reveal the systematic nature of the medical deception surrounding sleep therapy. Rather than evaluating patients based on their subjective reports of comfort or rest quality, Hippocratic diagnosis focused on identifying signs that would justify prescribing specific types of therapeutic discomfort. Physicians were trained to interpret patient complaints about uncomfortable sleeping as symptoms of humoral imbalance that required treatment. Through even more uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. A patient who reported difficulty sleeping on hard surfaces was diagnosed with excessive blood heat that required cooling through harder surfaces. A patient who adapted too well to uncomfortable bedding was diagnosed with dangerous phlegmatic accumulation that required more stimulating discomfort. The prescription methods used in Hippocratic sleep medicine were remarkably sophisticated in their ability to transform any patient condition into a justification for systematic discomfort. Hippocratic physicians developed elaborate classification systems for different types of therapeutic sleeping surfaces, with specific combinations of materials, construction techniques, and usage protocols prescribed for different medical conditions. These weren't simple recommendations for harder or softer bedding, they were complex medical interventions that required specialized knowledge to implement properly and ongoing medical supervision to adjust effectively. The most revealing aspect of Hippocratic sleep medicine was its approach to treatment success and failure. According to Hippocratic medical theory, successful treatment was indicated not by improved patient comfort or better sleep quality, but by the patient's ability to endure increasingly uncomfortable sleeping arrangements without complaint. A patient who continued to report discomfort after weeks of sleeping on prescribed therapeutic surfaces was considered to be making progress, as the discomfort indicated that the treatment was successfully challenging the humoral imbalances that caused the original illness. A patient who adapted to uncomfortable sleeping and no longer experienced significant discomfort was often prescribed even more uncomfortable arrangements to ensure continued therapeutic benefit. The economic aspects of Hippocratic sleep medicine reveal how the systematic prescription of discomfort became integrated into a profitable medical practice that could generate ongoing revenue from patients suffering. Hippocratic physicians didn't just diagnose conditions and prescribe treatments. They established ongoing therapeutic relationships that required regular consultations to adjust and optimize the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements that formed the core of their treatment protocols. Patients were encouraged to view their nightly discomfort as a form of medical compliance that demonstrated their commitment to health and their respect for medical authority. The training and certification processes that developed around Hippocratic sleep medicine created a professional medical establishment with strong economic incentives to maintain and expand the systematic prescription of patient discomfort. Medical students were taught to evaluate treatment success based on the sophistication and intensity of the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements they could prescribe and manage, rather than on any measure of actual patient improvement or satisfaction. The most respected physicians were those who could devise the most elaborate and theoretically sophisticated forms of therapeutic sleep discomfort, while physicians who focused on patient comfort or subjective well-being were considered medically unsophisticated or professionally compromised. The social dynamics surrounding Hippocratic sleep medicine reveal how medical authority was used to legitimize and expand the systematic discomfort that characterized Greek domestic life. Physicians became cultural authorities, not just on questions of health and disease, but on the proper relationship between comfort, virtue, and human flourishing. Medical recommendations about sleeping arrangements carried weight far beyond their lap. Physicians, beyond their lecid elmode, beyond their lecid elises, my lecid elist, my lecid elise, be zicid, be city sis, but on the lecid of the lecid, my lecid and I sis, my lecid elide, my lecid elev, my lecid elev, my lecid alas, so I vend, I decide, my lecid you will be lalid elev, we be lies it, I so unag. by I light a lie, kasik by sigai, kasi you sit to say me great kapisu we love it, gets it to we I die, but you sit a picard, is it kabastic, until it taste and let's get it to sick geet to sit and head of the best that goes that's the beer and some says that would play therapeutic applications influencing architecture, furniture design, textile production, and social customs throughout Greek society. The prescription of uncomfortable sleep became a form of cultural prescription that shaped how Greeks understood the relationship between physical experience and moral development. The religious dimensions of Hippocratic sleep medicine were particularly sophisticated in their ability to combine medical authority with spiritual mysticism to justify systematic patient discomfort. The sacred sleep therapy practiced at healing temples like the Asclepian wasn't presented as an alternative to rational medicine, but as a complement to it. With religious and medical authorities working together to convince patients that their suffering was both therapeutically beneficial and spiritually meaningful. The combination of medical and religious authority created a comprehensive, cultural framework that made patient discomfort virtually impossible to question or resist. The international influence of Hippocratic sleep medicine reveals how Greek medical practices were exported throughout the Mediterranean world as examples of advanced healthcare that other civilizations should adopt and adapt to their own medical traditions. Greek physicians traveled throughout the ancient world, establishing medical practices based on the systematic prescription of therapeutic discomfort and training local practitioners in the Hippocratic methods of converting patient suffering into medical authority. The spread of Greek medical practices represented one of the most successful professional export campaigns in ancient history, establishing medical traditions that would influence healthcare throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. The philosophical implications of Hippocratic sleep medicine reveal how medical practice had become integrated into broader Greek cultural values that celebrated suffering as morally beneficial and viewed comfort as potentially dangerous to human development. Medical prescriptions of uncomfortable sleeping weren't just therapeutic interventions. They were expressions of fundamental philosophical beliefs about human nature, the relationship between body and soul, and the proper role of pleasure and pain in human life. The medical framework provided scientific legitimacy for cultural values that might otherwise have been questioned or challenged by patients seeking relief from systematic discomfort. The most troubling aspect of the Hippocratic medical approach to sleep was how it systematically undermined the basic human need for rest and recovery, while presenting this undermining as advanced healthcare. Patients who sought medical help for sleep-related problems were prescribed treatments that would make their sleep worse, not better, all under the guise of sophisticated medical intervention. The system was designed to perpetuate itself by ensuring that patients would never achieve the restful sleep that might have resolved their original complaints, thus creating ongoing demand for medical services that provided no genuine benefit, while generating substantial revenue for practitioners as Hippocratic medicine spread throughout the Greek world and began to influence medical practice in other Mediterranean civilizations. The fundamental deception at its core, the idea that patient discomfort could be prescribed as therapy, became increasingly sophisticated and difficult to detect. But this raises profound questions about the relationship between medical authority and patient well-being. Was the systematic prescription of sleep discomfort simply a product of primitive medical knowledge? Or was it a deliberate professional strategy designed to maintain medical authority and generate ongoing revenue from patient suffering? The mature development of Hippocratic sleep medicine during the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE reveals how medical authority had evolved into a comprehensive system for converting patient suffering into professional prestige, economic profit, and cultural influence that extended far beyond the boundaries of healthcare itself. As Greek medical practices spread throughout the Mediterranean world and established themselves as the standard of advanced civilization, The systematic prescription of therapeutic discomfort became increasingly sophisticated and difficult for patients to question or resist. The elaboration of humoral theory during this period provided Hippocratic physicians with increasingly complex theoretical frameworks for justifying virtually any form of patient discomfort as medically necessary and therapeutically beneficial. The original four-humor system had evolved into elaborate diagnostic schemes that could identify dozens of different humoral imbalances, each requiring specific types of therapeutic sleep discomfort administered according to precise protocols that only trained physicians could properly prescribe and supervise. These expanded humoral theories weren't based on empirical observation or clinical experience. They were intellectual constructions designed to provide medical justification for predetermined cultural commitments to systematic patient discomfort. The development of specialized medical sleeping equipment during this period represents perhaps the most cynical aspect of how Hippocratic medicine transformed patient care into patient exploitation. Physicians began prescribing custom-built therapeutic sleeping surfaces that incorporated specific materials, construction techniques, and usage protocols designed to deliver precise doses of medical discomfort according to individual patient conditions and treatment progress. These medical sleeping devices weren't just uncomfortable, they were uncomfortable in theoretically sophisticated ways that required extensive medical training to understand and professional supervision to implement safely. The most revealing aspect of these therapeutic sleeping devices was how they managed to combine maximum patient discomfort with maximum cost while maintaining the medical pretense that they represented advanced healthcare technology. The construction of medical sleeping equipment required specialized materials that had to be imported from distant regions, expert craftsmanship that could only be provided by medical equipment specialists, and ongoing maintenance that required regular physician consultations to ensure proper therapeutic effectiveness. Patients were charged premium prices for sleeping equipment that was guaranteed to make their rest more difficult and unpleasant, all under the guise of receiving the most advanced medical care available in the ancient world. The prescription protocols that developed around therapeutic sleeping equipment revealed the systematic nature of the medical deception that characterized mature Hippocratic practice. Physicians developed elaborate schedules for adjusting sleeping, surface hardness, modifying pillow-filling materials, and altering sleeping position requirements based on patient responses to treatment and seasonal variations in humoral balance. These protocols weren't designed to improve patient comfort or sleep quality. They were designed to ensure that patients would never adapt to their uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, thus maintaining ongoing demand for medical supervision and equipment modification. The diagnostic techniques used to evaluate patient progress during therapeutic sleep treatment reveal how Hippocratic physicians had learned to interpret any patient response as evidence of successful medical intervention. Patients who reported improved sleep quality were diagnosed with dangerous humoral adaptation that required more intensive therapeutic discomfort to prevent relapse. Patients who continued to experience sleep difficulties were considered to be responding appropriately to treatment, with their ongoing discomfort serving as evidence that the ruby was successfully challenging the underlying humoral imbalances that caused their original condition. The system was designed to ensure that no patient response could be interpreted as evidence of treatment failure or reason to discontinue the prescribed discomfort. The training and certification processes that developed around therapeutic sleep medicine during this period created a professional medical establishment with strong institutional incentives to maintain and expand the expensive prescription of patient discomfort. Medical schools began offering specialized courses in therapeutic sleeping surface design, humoral sleep diagnostics, and patient compliance management that taught students to view patient suffering as a professional tool rather than a problem to be solved. The most prestigious medical positions were reserved for physicians who could demonstrate expertise in prescribing and managing the most sophisticated forms of therapeutic sleep discomfort. the economic implications of mature Hippocratic sleep medicine were staggering in their scope and complexity. The medical industry that developed around therapeutic discomfort represented a significant portion of Greek economic activity. With specialized craftsmen producing medical sleeping equipment, merchants importing exotic therapeutic materials, and service providers maintaining the complex infrastructure required to deliver systematic discomfort to paying patients. These economic interests created powerful constituencies with strong incentives to maintain and expand medical practices based on patient suffering rather than patient healing. The social dynamics surrounding therapeutic sleep medicine reveal how medical authority had become integrated into broader Greek cultural systems of social control and status differentiation. Physicians didn't just treat individual patients, they served as cultural authorities who could legitimize social practices, influence domestic arrangements, and shape public policy based on medical recommendations about proper sleeping habits and therapeutic sleeping arrangements. The prescription of uncomfortable sleep became a form of social prescription that reinforced existing hierarchies while providing medical justification for systematic discomfort throughout Greek society. The international expansion of Hippocratic sleep medicine during this period demonstrates how Greek medical practices were successfully exported to other Oceanian civilizations as examples of advanced healthcare that represented the pinnacle of medical sophistication. Greek physicians established medical practices throughout the ancient world, training local practitioners in the Hippocratic methods of therapeutic discomfort and creating international networks of medical professionals committed to the systematic prescription of patient suffering. The success of this medical export campaign established Greek approaches to healthcare as the international standard, influencing medical practice throughout the ancient world. The philosophical developments that emerged around therapeutic sleep medicine during this period reveal how medical practice had become integrated into comprehensive intellectual systems that could justify systematic patient discomfort as essential to human flourishing and moral development. Medical philosophers developed elaborate theories about the relationship between physical comfort and spiritual corruption, arguing that therapeutic discomfort served not only medical purposes but also moral and philosophical functions that were essential to human development. These philosophical frameworks provided intellectual legitimacy for medical practices that might otherwise have been questioned by patients or criticized by competing medical traditions. The religious dimensions of therapeutic sleep medicine became increasingly elaborate during this period, as medical and religious authorities worked together to create comprehensive cultural frameworks that could justify systematic patient discomfort as both medically necessary and spiritually beneficial. Temple healing complexes began incorporating Hippocratic diagnostic techniques into their religious healing practices, while Hippocratic physicians began using religious concepts and terminology to explain their therapeutic methods. The combination of medical and religious authority created powerful cultural institutions that could resist criticism and maintain patient compliance with uncomfortable treatment protocols. The artistic and literary representations of therapeutic sleep medicine from this period reveal how Greek culture had learned to celebrate and idealize medical practices based on systematic patient discomfort. Medical texts, philosophical writings, and artistic works consistently portrayed therapeutic sleep discomfort as evidence of advanced civilization and sophisticated healthcare, while comfortable sleeping arrangements were depicted as signs of medical ignorance or moral corruption. The cultural representations were so consistent and pervasive that they helped create and maintain public support for medical practices that systematically undermined patient well-being. The most troubling aspect of mature Hippocratic sleep medicine was how it had evolved beyond simple medical error or primitive healthcare into a comprehensive professional system designed to exploit patient vulnerability while maintaining the appearance of advanced medical care. The systematic prescription of therapeutic discomfort wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of limited medical knowledge, it was a deliberate professional strategy that allowed physicians to maintain authority, generate revenue, and expand influence. By convincing patients that their suffering was medically beneficial and professionally supervised, the demographic and public health implications of widespread therapeutic sleep medicine during this period were profound and lasting, affecting population health, economic productivity, and social stability throughout the Greek world. The systematic sleep deprivation and chronic discomfort that resulted from medical prescriptions of therapeutic discomfort contributed to increased rates of illness, reduced life expectancy, and decreased cognitive and physical performance that undermined the foundations of Greek civilization. While individual physicians prospered from the systematic prescription of patient discomfort, Greek society as a whole suffered from the public health consequences of medical practices that made the entire population less healthy and less capable. As Hippocratic sleep medicine reached its mature form during the later classical period, it had become clear that the system served the interests of medical professionals rather than the needs of patients. The elaborate theoretical frameworks, sophisticated prescription protocols, and comprehensive institutional structures that characterized mature therapeutic sleep medicine were all designed to maintain medical authority and generate professional revenue rather than to improve patient health or well-being. The question that emerges from this analysis is whether the systematic medical prescription of patient discomfort represented a corruption of otherwise legitimate medical knowledge, or whether it was an inevitable result of creating professional medical institutions with economic incentives that were fundamentally opposed to patient health and, being the final phase of classical Greek medical deception represents both the ultimate refinement of therapeutic discomfort as a medical specialty and the beginning of its exposure as a systematic fraud that had compromised the health and well-being of entire populations while enriching a medical establishment that had learned to profit from patient suffering rather than patient healing. By the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, as Greek political power waned, but Greek medical influence continued to spread throughout the Mediterranean world, the elaborate systems of medically prescribed sleep discomfort had become so sophisticated and institutionalized that they were virtually indistinguishable from legitimate health care. The culmination of Hippocratic sleep medicine during this period can be seen in the development of what might be called precision suffering protocols, comprehensive medical systems that could prescribe exact doses of specific types of discomfort calibrated to individual patient conditions, treatment history, and therapeutic goals. These weren't crude prescriptions for generally uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, but sophisticated medical interventions that incorporated detailed knowledge of materials science, construction techniques, and physiological responses to deliver precisely controlled forms of therapeutic unpleasantness that could be adjusted and modified based on ongoing medical evaluation. The theoretical sophistication of late classical medical sleep theory reveals how Greek physicians had developed increasingly elaborate intellectual frameworks that could justify virtually any level of patient discomfort while maintaining the appearance of rational, evidence-based healthcare. The original humoral theories had evolved into complex systems incorporating dozens of different bodily substances, environmental factors, and constitutional variables that could be manipulated through precisely controlled sleeping surface modifications. These theoretical systems weren't based on clinical observation or empirical research. They were intellectual constructions designed to provide medical legitimacy for predetermined commitments to systematic patient discomfort. The institutional development of medical sleep specialists during this period represents perhaps the most cynical evolution of the Hippocratic medical deception. Entire medical subspecialties had emerged around the prescription and management of therapeutic sleeping discomfort, with physicians specializing in specific types of uncomfortable sleeping arrangements for particular medical conditions. These sleep medicine specialists didn't focus on improving patient Rest or comfort, they focused on developing increasingly sophisticated methods for prescribing and supervising systematic sleep disruption as medical treatment. The most revealing aspect of these medical sleep specialties was how they managed to create the appearance of advanced medical expertise while actually providing no genuine healthcare services. Sleep medicine specialists developed elaborate diagnostic procedures that could identify dozens of different sleep-related conditions requiring therapeutic discomfort. Sophisticated treatment protocols that could prescribe precise combinations of uncomfortable materials and construction techniques, and ongoing monitoring systems that ensured patients would never achieve comfortable rest that might have resolved their original complaints. The specialization allowed physicians to charge premium fees for services that systematically undermined patient well-being while maintaining professional credibility through apparent medical sophistication. The research and development activities that emerged around therapeutic sleep medicine during this period reveal how Greek medical institutions had learned to generate ongoing innovations in patient discomfort while presenting these innovations as medical advances. Medical researchers developed new materials for creating more precisely uncomfortable sleeping surfaces, new construction techniques for delivering more sophisticated forms of sleep disruption, and new diagnostic methods for identifying conditions that would justify increasingly elaborate forms of therapeutic discomfort. This medical research wasn't aimed at improving patient outcomes. It was aimed at creating new opportunities for prescribing and profiting from systematic patient suffering. The quality control and standardization systems that developed around therapeutic sleep medicine reveal the systematic nature of the medical deception that characterized late classical Greek healthcare. Medical authorities established certification programs for therapeutic sleeping equipment, training protocols for sleep medicine specialists, and regulatory frameworks that ensured all medical sleeping interventions would meet professional standards for systematic patient discomfort. These quality assurance systems weren't designed to protect patients from harmful treatments. They were designed to ensure that all medical sleep therapy would be sufficiently uncomfortable to maintain demand for ongoing medical supervision and intervention. The international expansion of Greek sleep medicine during this period demonstrates how the systematic medical prescription of patient discomfort had become one of Greece's most successful cultural exports. Greek medical practitioners established sleep medicine clinics throughout the Mediterranean world, training local physicians in the Hippocratic methods of therapeutic discomfort and creating international professional networks committed to the systematic prescription of sleep-related patient suffering. The success of this medical colonization established Greek approaches to sleep medicine as the international standard, influencing healthcare practices throughout the ancient world and into the medieval period. The economic analysis of mature therapeutic sleep medicine reveals the staggering financial resources that Mediterranean societies devoted to maintaining and expanding medical systems based on systematic patient discomfort. The total economic investment in uncomfortable medical sleeping equipment, specialized therapeutic materials, expert sleep medicine practitioners, and ongoing medical supervision represented a significant portion of healthcare spending throughout the region. These resources could have been used to develop genuine medical treatments, improve public health infrastructure, or address actual patient needs, but instead, they were devoted to elaborate professional systems designed to profit from patient suffering. The public health implications of widespread medical sleep discomfort during this period were catastrophic in their scope and severity. The systematic sleep deprivation that resulted from medically prescribed therapeutic discomfort contributed to increased rates of mental illness, reduced immune system function, and decreased cognitive performance that affected entire populations. The medical establishment that was supposed to protect and improve public health had instead become a systematic threat to population well-being, prescribing treatments that made the entire society less healthy, less productive, and less capable of addressing genuine medical challenges, the social and cultural consequences of the mature medical sleep deception extended far beyond healthcare itself, influencing legal systems, educational institutions, and religious practices throughout Greek society. Medical authority had become so thoroughly integrated into cultural institutions that the prescription of systematic discomfort extended into non-medical areas of life. With legal punishments, educational disciplines, and religious practices, all incorporating elements of medically justified suffering. The result was a society where systematic discomfort had become normalized and institutionalized. At every level of social organization, the philosophical and psychoeducational implications of the medical sleep deception reveal how the systematic prescription of patient discomfort had influenced Greek approaches to knowledge, truth, and human nature. A medical establishment that could convince patients that their suffering was beneficial had demonstrated the power of professional authority to override individual experience and common sense, establishing intellectual frameworks that prioritized abstract theoretical systems over empirical observation and practical results. The success of medical deception in the area of sleep therapy provided a model for professional authority that would influence Greek approaches to education, politics, and cultural development. The ultimate exposure of Greek medical sleep practices began with the rise of Roman power and the introduction of practical, results-oriented approaches to healthcare that focused on actual patient outcomes, rather than theoretical medical sophistication. Roman physicians, initially impressed by the apparent complexity and intellectual sophistication of Greek sleep medicine, gradually began to question why advanced medical treatments consistently made patients less comfortable and less healthy rather than better. The Roman emphasis on practical effectiveness and measurable results was fundamentally incompatible with Greek medical practices based on systematic patient discomfort. The collapse of confidence in Greek sleep medicine accelerated as Roman medical practitioners developed alternative approaches to sleep-related health problems that actually improved patient well-being rather than systematically undermining it. Roman physicians discovered that patients who were provided with genuinely comfortable sleeping arrangements recovered more quickly from illness, demonstrated better cognitive performance, and reported higher levels of overall health and well-being than patients subjected to traditional Greek therapeutic discomfort. These empirical observations directly contradicted centuries of Greek medical theory and practice, exposing the fundamental fraud that had characterized Hippocratic sleep medicine from its inception. The legacy of the Greek medical sleep deception would continue to influence healthcare practices throughout the Roman period and into medieval Europe. As the professional structures and intellectual frameworks that had supported systematic patient discomfort proved remarkably resistant to reform and replacement, the institutional interests that had developed around the prescription of therapeutic suffering, the educational systems that had trained generations of physicians to profit from patient discomfort, and the cultural values that had learned to celebrate medical authority over patient well-being all contributed to the persistence of medical practices that were demonstrably harmful to the populations they claimed to serve. The essential lesson of the Greek medical sleep deception extends far beyond the specific historical context of ancient healthcare practices. The systematic prescription of patient discomfort as medical therapy demonstrates how professional authority, theoretical sophistication, and institutional prestige can be used to legitimize and perpetuate practices that are fundamentally opposed to the interests of the people they claim to serve. The success of Hippocratic sleep medicine in convincing entire populations that their suffering was medically beneficial reveals the power of professional institutions to shape public understanding and individual behavior in ways that serve institutional interests rather than public needs. The end of the classical period marked not the disappearance of medically prescribed discomfort, but rather its transformation into new forms that would continue to influence healthcare practices throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. The Greek innovation of converting patient suffering into medical authority had established professional templates that would be refined and adapted by countless other medical establishments, seeking to maintain authority and generate revenue through the systematic prescription of treatments that served professional interests rather than patient needs. As the sun sets over the ancient Greek world, casting long shadows across the ruins of a civilization that once dominated the Mediterranean, we are left to contemplate one of history's most successful and enduring deceptions. For nearly a millennium, millions of Greeks went to bed each night resting their heads on pillows that were deliberately designed to make sleep as uncomfortable as possible, all while being convinced that this systematic discomfort was a mark of civilization, virtue, and advanced medical care. The story of ancient Greek pillows reveals something profound about human nature and social organization. With the right combination of cultural authority, philosophical justification, economic incentives, and professional expertise, entire civilizations can be convinced to accept and even celebrate conditions that are objectively harmful to their well-being. The Greeks didn't just tolerate uncomfortable sleep. They developed elaborate theoretical frameworks that transformed nightly suffering into a cultural virtue, an economic opportunity, and a medical necessity. Perhaps most troubling of all, the Greek pillow scam succeeded not because people were ignorant or primitive, but because they were sophisticated enough to create comprehensive cultural systems that could rationalize and institutionalize systematic discomfort. The philosophers, physicians, craftsmen, and merchants who perpetuated this deception weren't villains or fools. They were intelligent, educated people who had learned to profit from a system that convinced everyone, including themselves, that suffering was somehow superior to comfort. As we settle into our own comfortable beds tonight, supported by pillows designed to provide genuine rest and relief, we might pause to consider what systematic deceptions characterize our own civilization, what contemporary equivalents of the Greek pillow scam we accept without question, convinced that our nightly compromises with comfort, health, and well-being are somehow marks of sophistication, virtue, or advanced understanding. The Greeks, after all, were certain that they had achieved the pinnacle of civilized living, even as they spent every night of their lives sleeping on what amounted to padded torture devices. The true scandal of ancient sneaky Greek pillows wasn't just that they were uncomfortable light, was that an entire civilization had learned to mistake systematic suffering for cultural achievement, and in doing so, had created one of the most successful confidence games in human history. Sweet dreams.